good afternoon. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our 11th installment of Geothink&Learn on rural open data, international open data, and data sovereignty. My name is Sonia Solomon. I am the project manager at Geothink. So for those of you joining us for the first time, Geothink is a partnership funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So along with over 30 international partners, including nonprofit, academic, and municipal partners, and over 100 students. The project is led by our principal investigator, Professor Renee Sieber from McGill University. So I'm going to begin today's session by welcoming our group of speakers and then outlining some of the ways that you can use the Zoom feature to participate in today's webinar. So our panel chair today will convene today's meeting, Geothink collaborator Ian Parfitt. Ian is an instructor at the School of Environment and Geomatics at Selkirk College and coordinator of its Geospatial Research Center. Ian is also currently leading a project which is helping to develop open data for planning in rural British Columbia. So our first panelist today is joining us all the way from Uganda. So a very special welcome to Edna Karamagi. So Edna is incredibly passionate about open data and has been involved in it as an advocate for over 20 years so far, particularly in involving rural communities in sharing information. She is currently the program director for avap.biz, who develops platforms and encourages especially rural communities to engage in productive knowledge sharing in agriculture as well as nutrition. She is a resident in Uganda and is also executive director of the Busoga Rural Open Source and Development Initiative, also known as Brodsky, where she works with a network of farmer organizations to generate, collect, and share local information about effective agricultural practice. So next, we will hear from Tom Duell. Now, just a quick note that Tom will be joining us via audio recording only. Tom is a geographic information system technologist at the Regional District of Central Kootenay. And finally, we will close today's session by fellow McGill alum, Anna Brandușescu, Research and Policy Officer at the World Wide Web Foundation. So Anna's work is focused on driving a more inclusive use of data and enhancing digital rights through various data research and policy projects. Some of these include Women's Rights Online, IDEA, which is Initiative for Data Equity in Africa, as well as the Open Data Barometer. So Anna has over 8 years of research experience in data analysis, data standards, open source applications, and participatory projects. And she has previously worked for the Web Foundation in the development of pioneering the open contracting data standard with the World Bank. So without further ado, I will just get to a few ways that our participants can participate in today's session. So there are a few options for participating. You can click the raise your hand button at the top left of your screen. So this feature will allow you to ask a video recorded question in real time to our panel. You'll be asked to accept a video and microphone share request from the platform. And if you prefer not to ask a recorded question today, you can send a written one through the Q&A button, which is at the bottom toolbar of your screen. So this same feature has an anonymous option, which is able to send a written question without noting your name if you prefer that as well. Finally, I'll just note the general chat toolbar, also at the bottom screen. And we encourage our participants to use this chat box to chat with the panelists and amongst each other throughout the entirety of the event. Unfortunately, for those of you joining us via telephone, these options aren't available, but you can email us your questions with the info on our website at geothink.ca or tweet us your comments at geothink.ca. So just a reminder that this entire live feed will be recorded for dissemination on our website. And at that, I will pass it along to Ian.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sonia, and welcome everybody. Good morning from BC. I guess it could be just about any time with the international audience that we have today. So The topic is really exciting. I'm really fascinated by this topic of rural and international open data and data sovereignty. I know a little bit about rural open data in the north, and I'm really looking forward to finding out more about what's going on in other parts of the world. I think inclusion is a big piece of what we're all working towards here. A lot of the conversation around open data is really focused on urban areas or data in the global north. So I think all of what we're going to talk about today is broadening the conversation and looking at some perspectives that aren't always as widely shared as they should be, in my view. So I think with that brief intro, I'd like to move on into the presentation. So Edna, if you're ready to present, why don't we go to Uganda?
Hello. Hello, my name is Edna. Thank you, Sonia, for having introduced me over. And I think I'll go directly to my presentation. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting, just a second. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting my experiences. Like during the introduction, they say that I've been involved in open data for over 20 years. And yes, during this time, I have met and interacted different types of people and experiences, especially in the rural areas. So I'm going to bias my presentation by sharing my experiences and titled under Open Data and Open Development. Now, I'll start off by giving you a little brief about open data and agriculture in Uganda. For starters, in Uganda, sharing knowledge and data is totally legal, except for that information which will put our country at risk. I give you an example. There's the hard information that security hides that nobody ever sees. That is not accepted to share it. But there's information, simple information, that you probably look at as simple, but can put the country risk, like check people, how many checkpoints we have at a particular supermarket or something like that. That kind of information sharing is not accepted. Now in Uganda, we target food security, and by food security, we talk about producing a lot of food. We talk about food being available and also being accessible to the consumers. We also talk about people. We have this category of people that do not produce enough food for themselves. But we say that even so, they should be able to have enough income to buy food. So that is the bracket under which we look at as food security. Another probable important issue to note out about Uganda is that it has one of the fastest. The reason our agricultural bond has really grown and continues to grow with the government that is totally pro-agriculture. And in agriculture, we particularly target the second sustainable development goal of ending hunger and all forms of malnutrition by the year 2030. Agriculture contributes to 85% of our export earnings, and it also contributes to 75% of national employment. When I talk about national employment, I'm talking about employment both in the rural and in the urban areas. Still, even if it looks so rosy, we do have hunger and poverty still prevailing. We have 11%. FAO reports that 11% of our population is not food secure. We also have malnutrition cases where we have about 36% that are economically undernourished and stunted. At the end of the day, we are learning. Every day we learn, because you know at the beginning we had just 4 cash crops and a few food crops, but today with Ugandan soils you can plant anything. We have recently I learned that we can even grow apples in the varieties that have come through that you can grow in the hotter parts of the country. So with all this has come up as a result of increased exposure And this only calls for a need to continue to share knowledge, because if we do not share this knowledge, then people will not know. Probably at the beginning of my introduction, I forgot to mention, apologize for the dark screen. I'm in the rural parts of the country. And any moment, if I go off, do not worry. It is because electricity has gone off. We do not have a backup system, the power system here. So if electricity goes off, please, any questions that will follow up, please use Twitter. So the moderator will share the Twitter hashtag with you, and I'll gladly respond to them tomorrow as soon as I get power. Now, I go to the gist of my presentation. Like I told you, I'm going to share with you sharing data, how we share data, how people are sharing data, and how you can do it within the rural settings. Now, I drew it out in basically 4 stages. The first stage is draw your plan. Sit down and draw what you want. Know what you want to share. You need to know whom you want to share it with. You need to know where you want to go to, because you cannot just storm. We have different communities with different cultures. And then also you need to know how you are going to do it there and when is the period, because you will find, for instance, if you want to go and start implementation during a planting season, you will not get the people because they are in the gardens, you see. If you go on a market day, you will not get the people there because they have gone to the market to sell their produce and buy other products. Now, after you have drawn your plan, then you have to go and do your homework in the targeted area. Because now it's very clear for you it's very clear to you, your targeted area. You have to go and do your homework there. I will come back to this stage later. When you have gotten the homework and you have analyzed in respect to your targeted area, then you come back home and you edit your plan in accordance to the homework that you have done. Again, I totally apologize for the background noise. There's nothing, I cannot control the background noise. I am totally in the community area. I totally apologize for that. So, okay, going back to my presentation, when you have done your homework in the targeted area, I'm coming back to that again. Now you come back and you edit your plan in accordance to the homework you have done. Because remember, you had a plan, you've done your homework, now you have to edit your plan depending on the information that you have got. After that, you can go ahead and implement. Now let me go back to the slide of do your homework in the targeted area. There are basically 2 steps from experience in collecting data. The first one is understand the area and the cultures. We have different cultures. Basically, the country has got the Bantu speaking people, and we have the Nilotics. The Nilotics are in the north, and then we have the Bantu in the southern part and the central. Now, you need to understand, for instance, why are people meeting? You'll find in some areas, people meet just for social purposes. I give you an example. We had a farmer we were working with in our program, the CELAC project program, collecting an exchange of local agriculture content. And we went to the east, to Budaka district, and there was this farmer. Budaka district is well known for rearing of turkeys. Now in this district, people rear turkeys, but suddenly the turkeys were dying and nobody knew why they were dying except one farmer who was called Rico. That one farmer, his turkeys were doing so well. But you can imagine, people would meet with him. He was very well known in the village. People would meet with him, they gossip, they drink, they go attend burials together, they meet and talk in the bars, but none of them even thought about asking him why he still had turkeys on his farm, yet everybody else, their turkeys were dying, you see. So you need to find out this reason. I mean, you need to find out why are people meeting. And then that way, you can be able to adjust. Some people meet to discuss just for problems where they have the meetings, the monthly meetings. During these monthly meetings, they discuss security issues. They discuss maybe home marital problems, because then they hold it like a court session, and you bring your problem there. If the problem is your wife is, maybe is not satisfying you sexually, or she's beating you up, or she's lazy, you bring it out there in the court, and then people respond. You get the response there and then. So you need to know, why are people meeting? How often do they meet? what is it that they mean for? And then also you need to know that many times in the many communities I've interacted with, people meet, the crops that you grow or the animals you rear is totally your business. Like Wiko's case I've given you, it's totally your business. It only becomes their business, for instance, if your cows come and feed on my sweet potatoes, then it becomes my business. Then we start to talk, you see. Another, you need to understand about that many people don't document. The information is in their heads, and to them, it is passed on from generation to generation. You need to consider that many of the people don't take the notes. So you also need to understand that some people respond to questions only when asked. If you don't ask the question, they will not give you the answer, okay? Others are shy to ask when faced with a problem. I remember in Woblenzi, we had the farmers. The farmers, when we went there to introduce to them the concept of sharing knowledge, we found that they were about to lynch one of them, a lady, because according to them, only her sweet potato garden was doing well and the rest were attacked by sweet potatoes. It is not until we got them into the concept of sharing that they realized that, A, it is because she is harvesting the caterpillars, sun drying them, mixing them with water, spraying her garden, and then the caterpillars migrate to the other gardens. But without that kind of intervention, she was going to be lynched. You need to also know that you need to consider the gender aspect. You will find some areas, for instance, in Mayuge district. If you go there and you say, because the male is the dominant gender, we're going to bring the males together and engage them in open data. But the males, if your data, if the kind of content, if your topic is agriculture, and then you think you're going to involve the men, I think you're going to backfire, because the male do not go to the gardens. If they do, they are very few. It's mainly the women who go to the gardens. So the women know how they grow their crops, they know how they weed, they know when to do it, and the whole process. Now, another issue you need to consider, which is the second point, is the methods that they use when sharing knowledge. Some cultures are very, what should I say? Their degree of acceptance to change is not very strong. So you need to know how they share their knowledge. You need to know how best you can synchronize their methods with your methods. And then you also need to know if you're talking the same language with them and who do they listen to. So at the end of the day, you need to approach the community with not with the I know it all airs around. You need to go and listen to them. When you listen to them, then you will be able to come back, to get back to your setting and be able to edit your plan according to the homework that you have done. It is only then that you can implement thereafter. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very much, Edna. So we do have some questions already being posted in our Q&A, and I thank our participants for that. Before we get to those at the end, we'll hear next from Ian Parfit. Ian, whenever you're ready, take it away.
All right, do you see that screen?
Yes, we do.
Great, awesome. So continuing on the conversation, I'm mainly going to be looking at, or only going to be looking at, rural open data in Canada, and specifically in this part of Canada that I'm familiar with, or have been working on primarily in Western Canada in the province of British Columbia. So when we first started getting into open data, people were asking, you know, why is it important to consider it from a rural perspective? And when we looked at the literature, we really found that there was almost nothing there about rural open data in the global north, a little bit more about the south. But what we see is that most of open data is provided, and I'm talking mainly about provision from the government side here, but different from Edna's presentation, but mostly provided by cities, provinces, and national governments. And from our perspective here, the data that's provided or made open by the province or the federal government is typically of too small a scale to be useful for local decision making. So in conclusion, really looking at that, open data for open government purposes is really an urban phenomenon in Canada and seemingly most of the rest of the global north at least as well. So a couple of examples of that. This is the first data set that was created in a GIS, some people say, and it was also one of the first that I used in my courses around open data because you could actually get a hold of this stuff when I started teaching in 2003. So the Canada Land Inventory was a national project in Canada to bring together sort of capability information about forestry, agriculture, wildlife, recreation. And as you can see here, with soil capability for agriculture, the region that I'm in, which is sort of where the 82 is, I don't know if you can see my cursor there, but there's basically a big data gap there. Even though there's agriculture in this region, it's considered to be too small scale to be important at the national level. So when they did their soils maps, it was a complete gap. This came from last far as I can tell in the north, that we have an aging population and generally an out-migration of young people. And then we have some series of technological capacity issues, including less highly trained people, but also a bit of problems with infrastructure around broadband. The way the market has rolled out broadband has begun sort of really made a priority of hitting the big dense cities first, where the most money could be made, and then it slowly rolled out to the rural parts of the country. So just to give you a little bit of more insight into our region, and I should mention that I'm a geographer, so most of my focus on open data has to do with spatial data. So this is the region that we're in with this red boundary, the part of the Columbia Basin in Canada. It's over 200,000 square kilometers, quite a big area, and in that area there's only 150,000 people. So that means we have about one person per 1.4 square kilometers. Another way of looking at that is the actual built up part of this region is only 1% of the area. So the communities that are within that red outline are all fairly small, ranging from about 20,000 and the city of Cranbrook all the way down to communities like Silverton and Slocan that have about 500 people. And when you look at, we've been doing some work with these communities and put up MOUs together and obtained data from them. There's a bit of a correlation between community size and their ability to produce and share quality data. And once you get below that sort of 1,000 or 2,500 person mark, you really start to see very little, except in some communities that have really made it a priority. In the case of broadband, these orange blotches are areas that the federal government made funding available to help address broadband gaps in rural parts of Canada. And you can see that there's quite a lot of those in this region. And as well as, that sort of intractable problem of getting broadband everywhere, it's a lot more expensive. It's about twice as expensive in rural Canada as in urban Canada. And as new developments in, as we go from 4G to 5G, those things tend to be rolled out in the big cities first, or fiber to the home and things like that. So the problem sort of continues even as we move into new technologies. Another big issue is that rural communities, again, we're sort of 1% of this bigger region. We rely a lot on areas outside the limit of the city for many aspects of life, including employment, not just agriculture, but also forestry and mining in our region, tourism, and then things like recreation, health and safety. There's a lot of concern around wildland-urban interface, fire and flooding, and also rural areas have the bulk of the parks and sort of the role of providing conservation or meeting conservation goals at the national level. So what that results in is that we're unable to dictate, our communities are unable to dictate the openness of key data that we need to get our hands on. So here's a little picture for you of Nelson. You can see how the community kind of bleeds into the forests around it. And one of the kinds of data that, in a mountainous region like this, we often want to access is contour information. When you go to the provinces of BC's open data portal, you get the blue screen effect, which is access to this data is restricted. It's not intended for public distribution. It's also got a license that prevents you from reusing it. On the other hand, if you go to Vancouver, they've got 2 or 3 data layers for contours, including 1, 2, and 10 meter contour intervals. So the data that's available at the province is 20 meter intervals, and in the city it's 1 meter, and they make it all available for download in their portal. So how do we address these concerns? One of the things that people talk about with open data is it provides a kind of a resource for people, entrepreneurs, to create applications. In the case of rural communities, there's going to be just little bits and pieces of data compared to what you could get if Vancouver or Montreal made their data open. So you really need to work together to create that critical mass. And that means developing standards together and perhaps sharing portals and licensing and things like that. And this could be done in an informal or formal organization. Right now, there's some very informal organizations in our region talking about data standards. There's a sort of a municipal GIS users group. But perhaps we could look at a formal organization like the Fraser Basin Council for inspiration. And what I've circled here about the history of this organization, which really looks at the overall Fraser River and basin in BC, which is quite a large area, probably similar to the area that we're looking at. And their watershed moment came when the mayor of Vancouver asked the mayor of Prince George challenged each other to clean up their parts of the river, and this made them realize that you needed efforts from everybody around the river across those jurisdictional boundaries in order to affect change. So yeah, if you'd like to see more about the work that we're doing, come to our website at www.ruralopendata.ca. So I think I'll hand it over to Tom now. He could probably provide a little bit more information about the same region.
Thank you, Ian. So Tom, you're on audio, but I understand you will be sharing some slides from your work as well?
Yeah, I've just hit my share screen button.
Okay, perfect. We have various layers and contours of access in today's webinar session.
Yeah. All right, let's try this again. Share screen.
There we go.
Okay. Sorry about this. I'm just trying to get my presentation to get going here.
No problem at all. We can see your screen.
There we go. Hi, my name is Tom Dool. I'm the GIS technologist for the Regional District of Central Kootenay. Yeah, we were invited to work with Ian a couple of years ago on his SHRC grant and stuff. I am essentially a problem looking for solutions. We are, and I'll get straight to it. We are a regional district, so we're made up of 11 rural electoral areas and 9 municipalities in the southeastern portion of British Columbia. We have some of the smallest municipalities in Canada, and you know, so when I say rural, I mean very rural. We're about 22,000 square kilometers of mountainous terrain and lakes. You know, with a population of 65,000 people total. We're strung out along, you know, a few major lakes in the areas and a bunch of valleys. Like I said, these are some of the smallest communities in the country, actually, like Silverton, New Denver, Slocan. They're absolutely tiny. So we have a unique set of challenges when it comes to open data. So you're getting out of the rat race, which is a common thing to hear here. We get a lot of amenity migrants coming in from Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and that sort of thing for the beautiful lifestyle in the Kootenays. But it does present a new set of challenges for people when you get out of the rat race and you come to rural areas. You know, our hope is that open data will provide solutions, but you know, the approach in rural is going to be different. Nobody's going to need to develop a parking app for Silverton. Okay, there's 8 streets. It's absolutely tiny. You probably won't see a lot of public transit apps here either because there's only 2 buses a day, right, to take you pretty much the whole length of the Slocan Valley, about 75 kilometers. But we're interested in different things, and we have some different challenges. You know, again, you know, capacity is an issue in our municipalities, and that's something we're really trying to deal with through open data. For example, you know, if there's a pipe break at night, sometimes you'll have the CAO in the ditch along with the head of the public works while the CFO is on the phone trying to get a new pipe. Or if the baseball diamond actually needs, you know, cleaning up, the CFO is out there riding the mower. So these people have huge demands placed on them in their communities, okay? And you know, open data, hopefully, and one of the things we're looking for out of open data is that it can help to alleviate some of those challenges. You know, a lot of these offices are paper right now, and that's it. So, you know, by taking a lot of their documentation and just moving it into the digital sphere so that it can be readily available online, so that they can email documents and that sort of thing, you know, that's a major step forward for them. It allows them to actually get down to the work of dealing with their community as opposed to just finding the information. In my role at the Regional District of Central Kootenay, what I'm really involved in is working with these small municipalities. We have a geospatial service here, so all these municipalities and all the rural electoral areas pay in through taxation for my service. I take their information, their land use planning documents, their mapping, their survey plans, their bylaws, all that information, make it digital, digitize it, and then serve it back up to the public through a series of websites and different services, you know, in order to create some opportunity for these governments to, you know, get down to working with their community. Open government and other oxymorons. This is another challenge that we have. So much of the knowledge here in these small communities is actually in people's heads. It's not on the desktop. It's not on computers. It's not even in filing systems. A lot of these people have been working in these communities for 35 or 40 years. And so, you know, as demographics take effect and as these baby boomers attrition out of these jobs, so too goes the knowledge. We lose all this information. So by opening up the data, by capturing the information, by making it widely available publicly, we're actually in the business of knowledge retention, not people retention, which is an exciting idea for these small communities. As well, when we get these small communities working together, you know, I'll bring up Silverton, Slocan, and New Denver a lot because they're 3 very small communities within about 50 kilometers of each other with, you know, very similar challenges and issues. And as we standardize their systems and as we present them with the, very similar opportunities, what we find is that they can actually work together. We're creating some efficiencies through open data for them and some opportunities for collaboration. Yeah, another thing is sort of big data in small places. We have these tiny little communities that are surrounded by very large issues insofar as flood mitigation and risk. We've had fatalities. 2012, we had a Johnson's Landing. We had the Johnson's Landing event where basically the side of a mountain came down and took out a small community. 5 people died. A dozen homes were completely buried. It was a really profound event in a small rural place. Providing access to the information required, to get out in front of events like Johnson's Landing. Ian was talking about, the contour intervals and stuff like that can be available. Well, we're collecting that LiDAR data and taking steps now moving forward to make high resolution digital elevation models and high def terrain models available to consultants, to the community, to the provincial government, so that we can get out in front of this insofar as emergency response goes and that sort of thing. This is the perennial cry of the small community. We're unique. You always hear that when you go to these towns and stuff like that. And they're unique for sure, but the challenges are pretty much the same. Almost every community in the RDCK is on an alluvial fan, which is a geohazard, with a creek running right through the middle of it. They all share a long history of mining and that sort of thing. They've all been here for about 125 years. Their infrastructure is all 80 years old. So the infrastructure deficit is starting to kick in. So, we have a lot of the same challenges. So, open data, and by making their information available, we've sort of been able to analyze it, look at it, and start to talk about standardizing it. Standardized land use planning, standardized floodplains and flood hazards, a standardized legal fabric, standardized asset management systems, so that these systems and platforms are transferable between communities, which is a really exciting idea for us, because we basically put a GIS on the desktop of all 9 of these tiny little municipalities, ranging in size from 150 people through to about 11,000 people. There's not a lot of places where that's actually available, where you can sit down with a computer and access the zoning or the OCP or the floodplain mapping bylaws for a town of 150 people. Moving everything into digital. When we first started some of these processes, you'd walk into these offices and everything is on paper. God forbid the sprinklers should go off. They would lose everything. So, by providing an opportunity to disseminate that information, by opening it up, by pushing it out to the cloud, we're really, by opening it, you're actually making sure we don't risk losing it in a fire or a flood, which are real events where we live. One of the challenges these communities are now dealing with is FOIPA. FOIPA is a great thing. We have records coordinators here in our office, but like a FOIPA challenge for one of these tiny communities is a huge deal insofar as allocating their resources, trying to find the documentation and all of that. These opportunities, by providing open data, by saying, look, open is the default, as opposed to going down the rabbit hole like they sometimes do, worried about litigation and that kind of thing. It's actually saved them a lot of time and a lot of resources. Shared geographic information services and shared platforms. We've taken a lot of these small communities, and because they've made their data open, because we've agreed this is the idea, we're now mapping out their infrastructure and using this for asset management and generating reporting that is going straight back to the community, so they can actually make informed decisions about what aspects of the community are we going to improve with our limited budgets. It's an exciting conversation, because that conversation used to be made almost exclusively at the village council level, and regular community members couldn't really engage in it because they didn't really have access to the information. But nowadays, the village of Salmo can't actually hold its village council meetings in the council offices anymore. They have to do it in the school gymnasium because they're getting so much engagement from the community. Now, it's a double-edged sword because those meetings go on forever, but it's also really exciting to see people that involved in it. Yeah, I think that file is around here someplace. You know, when you walk into some of these places, you know, and stuff is piled all over the place and everything. You know, it's a challenge to manage all this information. And the nature of accountability has changed. As the amenity migrants come from other places, they expect access to information now. You know, when people leave, say, Calgary and retire to this beautiful waterfront community in Silverton, and they want to talk about, you know, how the community is run or why this is happening this way or that way, you know, they need to have access to that information. So, you know, working with the communities to understand that level of engagement has been a really exciting aspect of the project. The turnaround time on information too, giving the communities the ability to you know, to provide those answers readily. You got to remember, you know, there are places. Sometimes people will have to drive 4 hours into Nelson in order to get a building permit. Okay, if we can provide that information through open data, through our GIS platforms, and through our records management system online, I mean, you're saving somebody an entire day and probably $150 in diesel by the time they drive all the way in and all the way out. That's a big hit for somebody living in a remote rural area. You know, they don't have to take planes, but it would almost be quicker. So having having that availability uh, for local government has been a big step forward. Infrastructure spending is generating a lot of debate in our communities. It's the infrastructure deficit, everything is now 80 years old, it seems. And, you know, we're spending a lot of money in small towns. Federal money is available, but, you know, if you rip up a street in a small community, I guarantee you half of that community will come to look you know, will come and have a big debate while the backhoe is working. It's, you know, it's one of the joys of living in a small town, but it's also, it's also one of the things that keeps conversation pretty lively and pretty active. So, you know, having those infrastructure plans open and available and having them tied to asset management and GIS and that sort of thing, and having all that available online really puts the truth out there so that people understand, like, no, we're doing this not because the village councilor's house is on that street. We're actually doing this because the plumbing is now old and we have to replace those pieces. Again, big data in small places. The RDCK is working in collaboration with Ian and the Columbia Basin Trust, Emergency Management BC, and a whole bunch of other municipalities. We're going to be collecting about $2 million worth of LiDAR by 2019. It's a huge exercise, but it's so exciting that some of these small places in the middle of nowhere actually have access to top-notch data. The analysis that it's driving is involved in a $500,000 federal, provincial, and local government partnership called the National Disaster Mitigation Program, where we're looking at all the flooding hazard, floodplain hazard, and geohazard for the for basically the whole of the RDCK. A very exciting project, you know, considering the landscape that it's taking part in. We're also currently pushing about 60 different spatial layers through our online GIS and REST endpoints that are informing the process. So, yeah, it's an exciting time here, and you know, this open data, rural open data initiative, working with Ian and his group has been a real opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tom. And I think we will hear from Anna next.
Sure. Okay. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon from London. So I'm Anna, and today I will probably take you to the global and then to the global south and maybe global again in terms of rural. So I will start with a problem with rural data in the global south, which it's probably the problem worldwide, and that is that we have a long way to go. So one of the projects I work on is the Open Data Barometer, which is an assessment of open government data in 115 countries, looking at readiness, implementation, and impact of open data. So a disclaimer on this part is that we do mostly assess national level government data. So again, when you come to indices and assessments that are global, usually I would say subnational level data isn't always the focus. So here you could see that most government data is still not open. So only 7% of data is fully open as of 2017 from 2016 research. And only 1 in 2 data sets are machine readable. Also, the open data that is available often isn't really the the data that people need, or belongs to the key data sets that we're looking at. So in terms of what are crucial areas, we define those as the following. So looking at budget data, company registries, spending data, contracting data, and land ownership, which I think the last would be a very interesting thing to discuss in the follow-up. No one has mentioned data sovereignty yet, so I would be curious to see how the other panelists and audience think about land ownership. And last but not least, most government data that is available is hard to use. So you don't have any documentations that's provided about, where the basic metadata comes from, or the documentation in itself. So given this, the challenges for data collection is really about it being mostly done at the national level rather than at a regional, city, town, or village level. And again, like working on with tools and on tools such as the Open Data Barometer, we do take stories and qualitative data from subnational levels, but they're not at the heart of the data, the quantitative data analysis that we look at from national open data portals and beyond in government websites, for example. And of course, the coarseness of data that is available and the data quality that's just not quite there in terms of open data. Again, for rural data, I would argue that that's also problematic. There are also a lack of champions in open data. So especially in the Global South, you really need a lot of advocacy efforts, engagement from different stakeholders to promote and understand what open data even means and how would it be useful for communities at a local level and at a national level, and not only to those communities, but to different players and audiences and actors in those communities as well. And this comes back to having this lack of technical capacity, but also a lack of knowledge sharing and dissemination. And back to what both Edna and Tom have mentioned, is that the knowledge a lot of the times is in people's heads, and a lot of that does not necessarily get captured and synced with the open data technical knowledge that is required, and oftentimes comes from the global north in terms of the way that these projects are disseminated. And again, so where does the data originate from? That can be a challenge because sometimes that's not known, or there is no data to begin with, especially rural data, but also certain countries just don't have the data at all, or they just don't have it open. So as you can see, land ownership data is 1% available for 115 countries. So how do you change that discourse of open to even have this data available that then can be analyzed to see if it can be useful or not? And empowerment with open data in the North is definitely different than the South. So in terms of the resources available, the knowledge, the affordability, accessibility of internet and the web, and also just the way people have talked to or know about open data, the meetups available, those will all factor in. So I will particularly focus on women in rural data in the Global South and bring in 2 examples. But before doing that, I just wanted to take you to the Women's Rights Online research from 2015. So this is actually from 10 cities in the Global South, in poor urban areas. But I will get to the rural part in a second. So women are 50% less likely to access the internet than men, and 30 to 50% less likely to use it for personal empowerment. So to use their voice politically or in a community-wise and so on, online. So it's important to take a step back and when assessing how the engagement around open data, and to note that even statistics and percentages and numbers around rural data are not known as much. So in our next phase of research, we will be comparing urban and rural areas, because this is also important for the Web Foundation and the partners to make that distinction, because we could probably hypothesize that these percentages would be less or more dramatic. So that's still a kind of a long way to go in research in balancing out what's been done in urban areas versus rural areas, even with access. So in terms of gender-based barriers for both access and use of internet, know-how is the #1 barrier that is followed by cost and relevance. So back to incentivizing for women to be on the web, and what does it mean for them to be there. So that's the same in terms of engagement and capacity building around why use open data in rural areas if it even exists. What's it in for them? So to take you to one of the 2 examples I have, this was a project and initiative done in Cote d'Ivoire called Tech Muso. This was led by my colleague Nana Wakama, and it happened in duration over 4 months. So it was a challenge done where 40 different groups were chosen, and it came down to 10. And here I'm only showing you three examples of what those projects ended up being. So Tech Muso, Muso is the Bambara language spoken in West Africa. It means tech women. And this was primarily done to engage women and urban and rural in participation in the open data landscape. But to do that, they needed to engage the ministries, the media, academia, and many other stakeholders to bring it together. So it was still a national-led effort that went into the subnational and to at the village level. So Scoop Procab was an idea that came together to help rural women cooperatives access market prices for shea butter. So this way, they were able to learn the market price of produce to sell it at fair prices. Then you'd have Kalanda that focused on SMS-based data-driven free health and services, and Devlogis, which again, SMS-based, looking at education. So you can tell right away that economic empowerment, health, and education are 3 sectors that are really important. Another project that focuses on the rural, again from a city level, that was then drawn down to a village level, is in Indonesia. So in Yogyakarta, the Open Data Lab in Jakarta from the Web Foundation and IDEA, an NGO in Jogja, worked together to open up gender data. So they looked at the subnational level of the women's budget, women's development budget, and seeing how that can be explained in ways that everyone can understand outside of finance system and finance people. So they've engaged in different ways of doing it. They build a portal, but they also put together these comics in Bahasa to get women involved and interested in learning more about understanding, how much money was put into what, how was it allocated, and how has that changed over time. And then also, drew it out in ways to see how we could see the percentages of this budget actually increased, and to also hold the governments accountable to make sure that this money did go to the communities and did go to the women. And they hold together like community groups and meetings to discuss the project as well. So it's back to having rural open data, but not looking at it just being online, seeing how you can bring it back offline and back online again. So the recommendations are many, and starting with, focusing on generating more disaggregated data. So, and not just disaggregated data because we want disaggregated data, but for rural needs specifically. So identify the sectors that are really important to meet rural needs, and then go from there. It's also about opening up existing data so that it's free and available for anyone to access and use. But of course, to be able to access and use it, you have to have connectivity. And so I will bring in here this 1 for 2 target, which comes from another initiative that I know and work well with, which is the Alliance for Affordable Internet. So this target is basically looking at having 1 gigabyte of broadband data per month that is for less than 2% of average monthly income. So I'll repeat that. So it's 1 gigabyte of broadband data per month for less than 2% of average monthly income. So to get everyone online to be able to engage, that's how we should do it. To have governments commit to these targets is really important everywhere, I would say. And third, building the technology capacity, as it's been said, both at national and subnational level and with different actors is key. And fourth, from a global perspective, being a part of different international initiatives, looking at the Open Data Charter, I see national governments who have signed up and also cities, but I don't see towns, I don't see villages. So I would recommend them to also sign up to understand and get to know the global community better. And as I mentioned before, encouraging communication in both online and offline among data and actors in rural communities is really key in this interim of connecting everybody. And incentivizing and promoting data champions. You really need to have those on a community at all different levels from different stakeholder groups to get involved. And which kind of leads to the 7th point, which is to empower institutions' data capacity. So if they don't have the data management, the data governance in place, then they won't be able to address these issues and the problems that like rural areas need and could possibly be solved with the help of open data. And as I made this presentation a bit focused on women, it's important to include some voices, especially of rural women and vulnerable groups in the process, because they often do get left behind and they need to be there in the engagement process from how data is designed and collected and published. And of course, we need things that are interesting and different to look at. So when we have analysis, we have to have different visualizations and ways to communicate data. And I would add to make sure that local languages are included, because often open data is a very either English or French or Spanish influenced sector. So we have to go beyond that. And in the language of the Sustainable Development Goals, it's all about leaving no one behind. So that's where rural open data could play a key role in accentuating this recommendation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, very much for that talk. Ian, we have a few questions lined up here in the Q&A portal, as well as some very lively discussions happening on chat. So perhaps we'd start with some specific questions from the Q&A.
Yes, that sounds good. Would you like?
Sure. So I have. Oh, and actually we have our principal investigator, Renee Sieber, who's asked a few questions, raising her hand at the moment to ask a live question. So why don't we start there? So Renee will be joining the session momentarily. There she is. Welcome. You'd like to unmute yourself, Renee? There you go.
I found this absolutely fascinating. I'd really like to get a sense from the panelists now that they've heard each other and our missing panelists as well. they've heard her, how much they think the differences are a matter of degree as opposed to something quite unique. Because I think that technical capacity might be a matter of degree, that there's just less of it in the global south compared to quite wealthy Kootenays in rural BC. And how much of it is really unique? And I'm thinking perhaps legal regimes are quite unique. Tom mentioned the FOIPA, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. It's a Canadian provincial regulation. I doubt that exists in any fashion in Uganda. It might. I don't know if Anna can speak to whether she knows freedom of information laws or sunshine laws exist in the areas that she's worked. That's it for me.
Would you like me to take us? It sounded like maybe Anna could be a good person to address that. But I guess what I could say to begin with is, yeah, I think that there's some different issues for sure. I think there's a technical issue maybe is more common, but then in different cultures, it sounded like in Uganda, there's in the small communities, there might be different things that people are commonly discussing or interested in versus in other places. And I think there could be different legal regimes as well. I think that, even how technology gets used could be a little bit different. People here are more likely to use not SMS for communicating, but some other method. But is that really a big difference? I would agree that maybe the technical ones are just a question of degree, but that's still an important problem. How do we surmount those digital divides?
So in terms of legal regimes, I'll start with data protection. So I know that Ghana has a Data Protection Act. South Africa has something similar. I'm not sure about Uganda. There are ones that, like bills in motion, for example, in Nigeria. But that's something different because that includes personal data. In terms of anything under rights of information, I would then argue that, of course, those are important to have in place, but then it's not really open data if you have to do a FOIA request on that data itself. So I think they're much needed across the world. But again, I think that's a separate issue. Like, why can't land data be open? It's open in 99% of the countries don't want that. I think that's an interesting sector that we can talk about because it's about rural and urban, and apparently that's one thing governments all have not really opened. And as opposed to map data, that's mostly open except for sub-Saharan Africa. That's also something interesting to see, like where those decisions are made. And in terms of technical capacity, I wouldn't say that the global north has more technical capacity. I think it's the way we also frame what technical means. So do we want people to do data standards work? Do we look at, like you said, like SMS-based solutions, because that's what works? Connectivity is also a problem. So then maybe technical capacity, it has various degrees of what that means and what's appropriate and necessary for a community, rather than having to get into, oh, we need machine readable data in CSV formats, and that's really important for us. It might not even be that. It's like, how can we get the data that's open and accessible in a way that's not the 5-star, based definition. So I'll end there for now.
Yeah, well, one thing just to add to what Anna said, and sort of reflection on those words and our conversation today. I mean, I think open data is such an interesting lens to explore the digital divide generally, and maybe also as a result of that or related to that, trying to create open data is sort of a way to help develop that capacity in communities. So it's an interesting lens, and perhaps also an interesting tool.
And perhaps on this theme of the differences in degrees, we can shift to a question on the metrics for assessing the value of rural open data. So we have a question from our participant asking, how do you know that you're achieving goals, and what are these goals? Curious to how different goals and metrics are to the north and south. So this is a panel-wide question, so if anyone would like to take this up. And I just want to make sure that, Tom, we still have you on the line. Okay, we may have lost.
I know there hasn't really been an attempt to really use those at the local level, or to develop ones that are more specific for rural places.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there are any standardized metrics across assessing rural open data, especially in larger projects like the one that I'm working on. So our methodology is open and available for everyone. I could share that with you, but again, it's not necessarily, doesn't cater to the rural setting. So I think it's unpacking, if we are assessing an implementation part, 15 sectors, which ones are relevant for you? Like, is the national data there good enough? What subnational data could be used? What project can you spin off of that to make it, to customize it to the kind of data you're looking for? And then again, if we look at the impact section, that it kind of takes into account stories and case studies that have been achieved with using open data, then some of those can be rural, but I wouldn't say it's ad hoc. It's not, there's no standard in separating urban from rural examples, for example. We don't have that yet. So that could be a suggestion of moving it forward. But I do think there's a much to sort of use that local to global and back again, and using some of these assessments that are global done in the open data space, but also initiatives like the Open Data Charter, where you get government commitments, and seeing how governments at all levels of a country could get involved, and whether they work together or not, that's a different question, but that would be interesting, especially for Canada, that's a bit more autonomous. So yeah.
Yeah, I really like Anna's point actually there, because that's kind of how, at a very local level where I'm working, how we judge the success of a project, right? Like when we get partnership, when we get a push from the public to get, like, they want this specific kind of terrain data called LiDAR, right? And then, we're local, and then province joins in, and then we get all the way to the feds. When we get that vertical integration, it really rolls, and it feels very successful at that point. When it's just local government sort of trying to roll the boulder around, it really feels like you're trying to push a rock uphill. It's very challenging, at that point.
Yeah, another question we had before the event was, what innovations exist in the global south that the global north can learn from, and vice versa? I think that's a very interesting question. It's, I think, part of what Anna's talked about, from the local to the global and back again, kind of addresses that. I think that it's been useful for myself, and I think Tom as well, to participate with Geothink and this wider circle of people to get some ideas as a starting point. But are there other things that you could think of Anna, that you've seen as innovations in the global south that we could adopt here or look at adopting?
I will think about that and come back to you, because I'm just thinking in the rural context as well. I think they're just different, so I'm not sure about, I think they are definitely innovations, but I'm not sure if they would be catered for the North necessarily, or vice versa even. I'm saying I think we can learn from each other in the process, and the process including, I think, Anna's sort of 4-step process of like, draw your plan, do your homework, edit it to, be flexible, and implement the revised plan and listen along the way. I think those points are really important, because sometimes you can have innovations being done in the global south that are still led by the global north. So it's important to get also make sure that the power dynamic between like local partners and international partners is fair, and the ideas and the problems are coming from the south, and the ideas owned as well. So I think that's something that it's this challenge that we're still working on solving. But in terms of TechMuso, that was really interesting, because there's just to show the engagement and the massive effort and energy of just even getting the project known across the country, and the massive amount of effort involved in communication is key. I think we really miss that in our data world, especially for more technical. We're like, oh, well, people just understand open data. It's like, no, you have to do advocacy, and you have to do it in a way that makes sense to people. So what's innovative is the communication. So do it in many languages, local languages, in very different ways. And I've seen that being done where I would, let's say, go in to talk about public procurement transparency, and not really mention open data per se, but work with listening to the problems in procurement, and then work your way up to see how you can incorporate open data in the problem itself, and look at it as access to information, which is a building block of open data itself. So it's not a pure example of a tech that I'm giving you, it's more of the process that's really innovative. So just being flexible, really listening, and bringing in like different ways of communicating, adapting to language and need and use are really important. And that's where we can really learn. And so we don't just do open data in one path, in one straightforward way.
And just to provide some feedback on Anna's comment, Renee has just noted, love Anna's comment that the work in the Global South could be masking the fact that it's actually Global North work in the South. So a little bit of feedback there. She's also noted that it's probably the rapid rural appraisals is applied to the North, and lots of work has been done regarding data collection and inclusion in the South. Ian, do we have time for I think we have time for one last question from our Q&A portal before we wrap up today's event.
Okay, so sure, let's tackle one about data sovereignty.
Big one.
How much data should not be open and should not be shared? What data may be collected but not shared outside the community? And I guess, again, is there something different about rural when it comes to data sovereignty? Anyone want to tackle that? I guess, I'll take a bit of a stab at it from a Canadian perspective. I know that it's an issue that's top of mind for the First Nations communities, and in particular the communities that are still in the treaty process, where they may have some data is about their traditional use and sacred spaces and things like that that they don't want to put out to the public. They don't want to make it open. And so, you know, given, I guess it's partly a power dynamic, partly an adversarial situation or process that they're involved in that puts data in that light. And yeah, so that's sort of what I know about data sovereignty. And I know it's an important concern for First Nations communities involved in research as well. Like, they want to make sure that if they're working on a research project, that question about data ownership is forefront in that process.
Hey, Ian, I think you could probably extend that analogy, you know, certainly to our Doukhobor community, and to questions around, you know, Japanese internment here in the Kootenays as well. You know, I think it's you know, these smaller, rather fragile communities, for lack of a better term, you know, they should always have a right to say. I mean, I would extend that even, we go through that certainly with trail groups, oddly enough. People build trails here, and you know, we want to push that information out there to make sure it's available and that sort of thing. But so often the people that really want to extend that information are trying to monetize it. And a community shouldn't be forced to monetize what's important to them. There should be some say. You know, that's the way we kind of try and look at it at a local government level anyway.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. We're a few minutes past our end time here, so I will take a moment to thank all of our panelists for taking time to join us today, as well as to Edna, who is no longer with us because of her internet connection. And I'll just remind our participants that if you did have specific questions for Edna, you can tweet them to us directly at Geothink.ca using our hashtag #Geothink&Learn11, and you'll see all of our Q&A posted there, as well as the full recording and transcript of today's session uploaded to our website at geothink.ca. So I'll take it from there. Ian, if you have a closing remark before we say goodbye.
Well, thank you very much. I found it to be a very fascinating conversation. And somewhat ironic that Edna's broadband would fade out, or maybe illustrative of some of the issues that we're tackling. But I'm glad that you found some way to work around that. And I think that, you know, in the end, I'd like to leave with Anna's point. You know, what we wanted is to leave no one behind when it comes to open data. And so thank you for raising the profile of rural and international open data today.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you to our participants for joining us in our lively discussion. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
You too.